Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. We are very grateful for kind introduction and invitation to Yanis and the Reset community. And we are really delighted to present our book, Intellectual Production in Socialist Europe, 56 to 68, Ideas in Flux. Sophie couldn't be with us today, and this is not only pity because she is not enriching the discussion, but also I wanted to make a joke. Here you can see a picture of her presenting the CU book on feminism almost 3 years ago in Tübingen. And I wanted to make a joke that sometimes history does repeat itself, because back then she was also giving a talk for the printed, she was waiting for the printed version of her book to arrive. And today we are in exactly the same situation, because we were really hoping to have the hard copies ready for this event to show you, but they are still on their way. So we hope it will change very soon. The contributors collected in the volume were first presented during the online workshop Late Modernity in East Central Europe, Philosophy, Literature and Politics between 56 and 68. This took place during the COVID time, so as you can see in this photo, it was a fully online event. And I really like this picture because it captures how focused everyone was. Just not always the case, in the third year or the second year of pandemics. You can almost feel this intellectual energy and curiosity that drove our discussions. And it was exactly from this small but inspiring workshop that our book was born. And one of our key ideas we wanted to explore was intellectual production. We chose this term because we felt that production captures the variety of materials and forms in which ideas were developed and circulated, not only in published essays, but also in party manifestos or internal documents, records of meetings and discussions. And those texts, even if not formally theoretical, were still part of the broader labor of thinking and creating within socialist societies. We also choose to use the term Socialist Europe instead of Eastern Bloc or Eastern Europe, because those labels tend to exclude countries like Yugoslavia or Albania, whereas the term Socialist Europe allows us to take broader and more nuanced view, one that focuses on internal dynamics and intellectual labor and not on international relations. And years 1956 and 1968 mark two key monuments of our study, like the first one with Khrushchev's secret speech and the events in Hungary, signaling the beginning of the de-Stalinization and open use to new streams in culture and intellectual labor, and 68 with the anti-Semitic campaign in Poland and the armed intervention in Czechoslovakia, which show again that the socialist ideal was no longer defensible in the same way. Our book is organized in 3 main sections, and I think I will give the voice to Una.
I would also very briefly like to thank you for inviting us, and I'll just continue to explain basically, or give some short summaries of the contributions. So there are 3. We divided the book in 3 themes. One is the first one is literature and the crisis of representation. As you can see here, those are the articles contributors. Very briefly, because Natalia will tell you about her contribution. Natalia focuses on Yevgenia Ginsburg and Vasily Aksionov, and she examines how this duo, mother-son, redefined the relationship between memory, authorship, and the critique at the end of the Thaw. Then we have Jens Helt, who shows that interwar Poland's blend of sociology, politics, and literary self-reflection through genres like memoirs and diaries, continued influence to influence post-war Marxist debates on the social role of literature, especially the novel. And during the post-1956 liberalization, this legacy encouraged theoretical discussions about literature's power to shape society. However, as Jens shows, the Hegelian ideal of totality lost its force, and literature was revealed to be overburdened with unrealizable social tasks, leading criticism to withdraw into pure aesthetics. Paradoxically, as he shows, both conservative and Marxist critics found common ground in the notion of the masterpiece as the model of artistic and human achievement. Then we have Ivana Perica, and she analyzes the Czech writer Josef Škvorecký, and this reveals also similar disjunction in Czechoslovakia, like what Health shows. While the Prague Spring articulated a political utopia of freedom, literature like The Miracle Game, written in 1972, exposed the fragility of belief itself, anticipating a post-utopian irony that refused this ideological service. And Perica shows that Škvorecký's The Miracle Game reveals a gap between political activism and literary production in Czechoslovakia around Prague Spring. Then we have a second team that was focusing on rethinking socialism, reform, revision, and the boundaries of critique. If you could just move the... So that's the second team. And here we have Bogdan Živković, who looks at the Yugoslav-Italian communist relations within a broader attempt to construct an anti-hegemonic pluralist socialism. He concludes that the collaboration between the Italian Communist Party and the Yugoslav League of Communists in 1956 and 1968 revealed early cracks in Soviet dominance over the international communist movement. Although the USSR formally maintained hegemony after both crises, so in 56 and 68, these moments triggered the deep structural ruptures that could not be silenced. So he basically shows that the PCI and LCY corporation shows that the dissent in those years was not merely anti-socialist or anti-communist or cultural, but also originated inside the movement itself from actors loyal to Marxism who sought to renew it. Ultimately, he argues that these reformist impulses of 1956 and 68, though politically limited, indeed anticipated the later challenges to Soviet control, like Eurocommunism in the 1970s, and foreshadowed the ideological decline and the collapse of Soviet-style communism. Then we have Bartolomej Kapica, who examines communist intellectual and a later dissident, Vladislav Bienovsky's notion of petrified revolution. And he identifies this in this systemic diagnosis of why socialism stagnated. As he says, a dialectic of acceleration and paralysis that mirror the era's intellectual oscillations between hope and disenchantment. So there is this constant tension of these two things. And he concludes, so Kapica concludes that although Bienkowski's ideas evolved between 1956 and 1968, their core tension, again, this between revolutionary acceleration and systematic stagnation, remained central. He saw socialism's inability to reform as a self-perpetuating closed system that could change only through external intervention. And his call for such intervention was expressed in a famous essay called Motors and Brakes of Socialism from 1969. And this basically led to his expulsion from the party. Yet, as Kapica argues, this notion of a petrified revolution framed 1968 not as the end of revisionism, but as a moment that reunited reflection on how socialism might be still renewed. We have then Bartosz Matija and Monika Woźniak, who provide a very conceptually rich contribution to the volume by tracing the evolution of socialist humanism in Poland from the immediate post-war period through the 1970s. And in their chapter, they challenge the simplistic conflation of Marxist humanism with revisionism, showing instead how Adam Schaff's humanism, initially conceived as a moral and legitimizing response to Stalinism, was gradually transformed into a technocratic ideology aligned with the productivist ethos of late socialism. And in reading of Matja and Wozniak, humanism was not merely a discourse of ethical renewal, but also a mechanism of, as they say, ideological stabilization. So they integrated humanist rhetorics with faith in technological and scientific progress, and this helped to re-legitimate the socialist project while muting the emancipatory potential. And then we have the third and the final chapter or topic that is on the knowledge, technology, and transformation of socialist epistemes. And there we have Clemens Gunther's chapter on the ecological imaginary of socialist cybernetics. And he extends this analysis of transformation to the sphere of scientific and technological thought. Drawing on examples from the GDR, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union, Gunther reconstructs a crucial, as he calls, latency phase in which cybernetics, once deemed and suppressed as bourgeois pseudoscience, was actually rehabilitated as a universal language of regulation, control, and integration. And in merging with ecology, cybernetics offered a new conceptual framework for understanding both nature and society as self-regulating systems. And his argument here underscores that this key epistemic shift from the move from revolutionary and humanist paradigms to a systematic and technocratic ones. The cybernetic transformation, as he shows, reframed the socialist imaginary around notions of complexity, feedback, and homeostasis, replacing the dialectical subject with a model of adaptive systems. And Nina Zeiler actually continues to thematize the volume's tensions in her discussion of the crisis of ideas in late 1960s Poland. She situates the decline of Marxist humanism that was already discussed by in the previous theme with the broader epistemological transformation. As cybernetics and structuralism gained dominance, conceptions of human agency and subjectivity were increasingly marginalized in favor of systematic explanations of society. And Zeiler interprets this as a moment of both exhaustion and mutation. So she says the socialist humanist utopia gave way to a mechanistic world view that mirrored the party state's bureaucratic rationality. And against this, the Polish literary theorist Maria Janion's anthropological hermeneutics sought to save a space for individual experience and interpretation, a move that also anticipated later post-humanist thought. In Zeiler's readings, the demise of humanism did not signify the end of critical reflection, but rather its displacement into new epistemic forms. And the notion of human survived as an interpretive figure rather than a political subject, and this is the shift that also resonates with Gunther's analysis of cybernetics, rationality, and its ecological extensions. So very briefly to sum up, what are the, let's say, more kind of conceptual threads that are found in this volume? So as we talked or we mentioned, they trace this deep transformation in the socialist intellectual field from humanist and revolutionary paradigms to systematic and technocratic ones. Across literature, philosophy, and science, these articles show they follow some common aspects of this period or themes. One would be a redefinition of the human, so from agent of emancipation to the object of regulation. Then a second part would be a displacement of utopia from this political struggle to the promise of scientific and technological mastery. And the third would be reconfiguration of critique. So a humanist descent gives way to managerial rationalities that absorb reformist impulses. And together we can say that these studies showed that the post-Stalinist decades were not merely a time of ideological thaw, but also an intense epistemological transformation. 1956 and 1968 appeared as nodal points in broader shift, so that is from the moral language of socialist humanism to the systematic language of cybernetics and structuralism, as at least captured in this volume. Yet the persistence of figures like Schaff, Bienkowski also show us that within this transition, the search still for human, for meaning, responsibility, and agency was both, still remained both philosophical, and political horizon. And I will pass now to Natalia Borisova.
I'm presenting actually my paper so as an example and as a case study from this volume. When Aleksandra invited me to participate on this project, I found the idea of describing the diversity of intellectual production in socialist Europe, so the many faces of human and unhuman of socialism. I found it very exciting, and I thought that it is a perfect frame for a topic that has long interested me: how changes occur in socialist societies, how they are prepared, how they are implemented in such societies. Because so we look at the 1960s or 70s or 50s here like to a time or a period of time which ended with the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. Yeah? But the contemporaries, so people who lived in this time, so they had a completely other feeling of the time. It was everlasting, it was endless, it was forever until it was no more. It is a well-known monograph of Alexei Yurchak here. And I asked myself how it was to people inside of these societies, on inside of these communities, who tried to change something in this monumental, in this concrete society in this endless time. So and that was the starting point for my presentation in the workshop and for my papers. And I wanted to show how marginal ideas become mainstream. How the intellectual production of a very small group of people was able to introduce new ideas into everyday life. I decided to focus on the issues of new history, specifically on how the narrative of Stalin's repressions was constructed in the USSR, and in what language, and what language was used to describe the repressions and the terror. I decided to work on two figures, on a writer and memoirist Evgenia Ginsburg and her son Vasily Aksionov, very popular Soviet and post-Soviet writer, people who were crucial actually for establishing the new memory of Gulag. So Evgenia Ginsburg is probably known to many of you. She was born in a liberal Jewish family, a very wealthy family. She was educated. She got a brilliant education. Already as a student, she joined the Communist Party. And then in the 30s, she was a propagandist, a teacher at the university, at the Communist University, and a wife of a high party official, Pavel Aksionov. In 1937, she was arrested as Trotskyist and sentenced to 10 years in prison, 5 years of exile. Her whole family was actually persecuted too. Her husband was persecuted and sentenced to 15 years. Her first son went to live with his father, it was a son from her first marriage, and then he died in 1942 in the siege of Leningrad. Her second son, Vasily Aksionov, whom you can see here, was put in an orphanage for children of enemies of the people as he was 5 years old, and it took quite a long time till his relatives could find him and rescue him and bring him back to the family. So only 1949, and you can see these photographs, at the age of 16, Vasily Aksionov could join his mother again at the age of 16. So you can see this photograph, it was took in Magadan, 1949, as so the family of only two people, Ginsburg and her son, joined then. Only after Stalin's death, Evgenia Ginsburg managed to return from Siberia to the so-called main Russia, And she immediately began to work on her memoirs on this time in the camps. She titled them «Крутой маршрут. Хроника времен культа личности». It is the steep path, the chronicle of the time of the cult personality. You know this book probably in English translation as A Travel into the Whirlwind, or in German translation as Gratwanderung and Marschroute eines Lebens, so different titles for different publications. In the late 50s, when Ginsburg started to write her memoirs, speaking of Gulag was possible only within an prescribed ideological framework determined by Nikita Khrushchev in his sacred speech, and it was like, so Stalinist terror could be described only as an occasional excess, only as a deviation from the party line, so-called перегибы. And that was exactly the storyline that Ginsburg used for her memoir. In the preface of her first part of her memoir, she addressed the Communist Party and the good communist, and mentioned the Leninist truth, Leninskaya pravda, which is now coming back. And she used all this usual rhetorical Soviet devices. In 1963, so she tried to publish her memoir, and she didn't succeed in it. But in the public houses of Yunus and Novi Mir, where he submitted her manuscript, people start to make illegally copies and disseminate them, so first in Moscow and then in the country, in the Soviet Union. So she became a well-known writer, so without publishing any books. Then, 1967, her book was somehow illegally brought to Italy and published in Feltrinelli publishing house, known to you probably with this Boris Pasternak affair and Dr. Zhivago. It is quite known. So, and after that, it was completely impossible to publish anything in the Soviet Union. This foreign publication, it was 1967. Then, 1968, the Soviet invasion in Czechoslovakia, and generally the end of the Thaw sealed the fate of her memoir. So official publication was not possible, and from that point on, Ginsburg wrote only and exclusively for this illegal samizdat dissemination. And that was a crucial point for her narration, because at this point she started to develop a completely new narrative of the terror, one that deviated from this official Soviet historiography. Ginsburg tells the second part of her story in an astonishing way, because Ginsburg now describes her life path as a religious conversion, especially as a Catholic conversion. So where the sparkling light of knowledge comes not from the Kremlin, but from the much higher institution. Yeah? And the story of female narrators, the story she describes, it is a descendance to the hell. And then several times she has near-death experience, and she is rescued by some angels, usually camp doctors. And at a certain point of the story, Ginsburg starts to fulfill miracles herself. She sacrificed her bread ration to an NKVD officer who arrested her in Kazan, acting in accordance with scriptures. So, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, Matthew. And then she met a person, a camp inmate from an Arctic north, whose face is deformed by frostbite. And she kisses him. She overcomes her disgust and kisses him like Francis of Assisi, so kiss the leper. And then she calls it a communion of Balanda. Balanda is a camp soup, yeah? And she celebrates this as a camp, there's a celebration of the camp community, the community of the victims. And those metaphors, death as an atheist and resurrection as a Christian, the deeds of faith, present her life story as a path to religious conversion. The miracle of salvation, however, occurs only when the converted female hero is willing to repent and to say the words of the penitential Catholic prayer, Confiteor, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, which is the title of the center chapter of this second volume of her memoir. Ginsburg interprets the violence done to her, the hunger, this hard labor, inhuman conditions, as a punishment for her false fate, for the seductions of communism, and she interprets her own life as a way of transfiguration from a communist sinner to a Christian believer. In the 60s, as Ginsburg is struggling so much to get her memoirs published, her son, Vasily Aksionov, is publishing book after book. And he is the most popular, probably, writer of the beginning of the 60s, and he is the face of so-called Soviet young prose, молодая проза. But in 1963, he was personally attacked by General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, probably also for his origin from this family of enemies of the people, and his brilliant career went to decline. Then he started having troubles with publishing his next book, and then he started a novel. Of course, it was also the Soviet invasion in Czechoslovakia, which shocked him so much. So his friends reported that he was for weeks in an alcoholic delirium. It was how Soviet intellectuals managed the crises at this time. And at this time, so he started, remarkably, to write a novel which he called The Burn, Ожог, and it is a story which revolves around the events of trauma and interprets the consequences of political terror in a psychoanalytical sense. A large part of The Burn deals with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. The novel revolves around the painful wounds of the Soviet history. It is, so to say with N. Komaromis, the violence of the August 1968 invasion, which recalls the violence of Stalinism as a repressed trauma in the collective psyche. The Soviet invasion triggers the memory of an earlier trauma, the trauma of the Stalinist terror. Stricken by the fact of the invasion, the protagonists of the novel start to remember their forgotten childhood in Magadan, and then the unspoken past can break through into the present in the form of dreams, visions, and anxieties. Aksionov uses a large number of psychoanalytical terms: trauma, melancholic repetition, guilt, shame, repressed sexuality, dreams, and that all brings repressed desires and traumas into consciousness. So this experience of being outcast, the camp experience, gives both writers, Ginsburg and Aksionov, the ability to engage with alternative communities and provides access to information that would erased at the center of the Soviet culture, but survived on its margins. Both authors invent in their writing a new language that can describe phenomena that eludes the grasp of the descriptive language of the official Soviet historiography. In this case, we can literally observe the shift from the official history writing with one master plot legitimated by the power and the multi-vocal illegitimate history telling. Ginsburg's testimony ends with the finding of faith, the acceptance of guilt, and the restoration of justice. Aksionov opts for a different meta-narrative in his work, one that is not religious but psychoanalytical. That allows him to model the past as open, unfinished, and in a style of a melancholic recollection or a post-traumatic repetition. One way or another, both writers formulate in their text the concepts which later, by the end of the 80s and at the beginning of the 90s, become crucial for description of Soviet terror, so guilt and trauma. Thank you very much.